"I don't like black women," Joon Woo said, his voice cold as steel. "They only bring trouble." The boardroom froze. 20 of Seoul's most powerful executives stopped breathing. Rain hammered the glass, 53 floors above the city. And at the far end of that table stood Vivian Johnson, a black secretary from Lagos, her leather folder pressed to her chest, staring down the most feared mafia boss in Korea without a flicker of fear. She walked forward, heels clicking. "Fire me if my work disappoints you," she said. "But if my skin disappoints you, sir, that is your weakness, not mine." Nobody had ever survived talking to him like that. Nobody. What happened next would tear open a lie buried for 20 years. Welcome to AfroKorean Stories by Janet Besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment below where you are watching from and what time it is over there. Before we begin, if you can't get enough of Afro-Korean mafia boss romances, you'll love my ultimate spicy Mafia Boss Love Collection. It includes 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories you won't find on YouTube. The link is in the description. Now, let's jump into today's story. Rain hammered against the glass walls of Han Group's executive boardroom on the 53rd floor, turning the city lights below into long smears of gold and red. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The long black conference table stretched between them like a border no one dared to cross. And at the head of it stood Joon Woo, 24 years old, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most of them earned in a year, his hands sliding slowly out of his pockets like a man who had all the time in the world to ruin your life. At the other end of the room stood Vivian Johnson, 22, a navy blue business suit pressed to the last thread, a leather folder held against her chest like a shield she didn't yet know she needed. She had walked in less than 60 seconds ago, smiled at the room, and introduced herself as the new executive secretary. And in those 60 seconds, the temperature of the entire floor had dropped so hard you could almost see people's breath. "I said," Joon Woo repeated, his voice quiet in the way a blade is quiet. "Replace her." One of the older executives, a man named Director Park, who had survived 3 corporate purges and still flinched at loud noises, cleared his throat. "Sir, she was personally recommended by the chairman before his passing." "The chairman is dead," Joon Woo said, still not raising his voice. "The dead don't run my company." "Of course, sir. I only meant, I know what you meant." Joon Woo's eyes never left Vivian. He looked her up and down, slowly, the way a customs officer looks at a suitcase he has already decided to open. And then he said it, loud enough for every single person in that room to hear, loud enough that it would echo in Vivian's ears for the rest of her life. "I don't like black women." He let the sentence land, watched it hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. "They only bring trouble, every single time." Somewhere near the window, an assistant dropped her pen. It clattered against the marble, and nobody even flinched, because a dropped pen was nothing compared to what had just happened in that room. 2 bodyguards near the door exchanged a glance. The air itself seemed to lean away from him. Vivian did not cry. She did not argue. She did not run. For one heartbeat she simply stood there, and if you had been close enough, you would have seen something cross her face that was not fear. It was recognition. Because she had heard versions of that sentence her whole life. She had heard it in shops that watched her hands. She had heard it in classrooms where people spoke to her slowly. She had never once heard it said this plainly, this proudly, in a room full of grown men who were too afraid to breathe. And somewhere behind her ribs, her mother's voice rose up, steady and warm and unbreakable, the voice that had raised her across an ocean. You do not shrink yourself to make anyone comfortable. You take up your space. So she walked forward, calm, unhurried, heels clicking against the marble in a steady rhythm that somehow made the silence louder. She reached the conference table, set her leather folder down on its polished surface with a soft, deliberate tap, and lifted her chin to look Joon Woo directly in the eyes. Nobody looked Joon Woo directly in the eyes. Grown men had been carried out of this building for less. Director Park actually took a small step backward, as if proximity to her might be contagious. "Mr. Han," she said, and her Korean was flawless, fluent, carrying only the faintest music of somewhere far away. "If my work disappoints you, fire me. Today, this hour. I won't say a single word. I'll pack my desk and thank you for the opportunity on my way out." She paused. Let the room lean in. "But if my skin disappoints you," her voice did not shake, did not climb, did not crack, "then that is your weakness, sir, not mine. And no amount of money in this building will ever fix it for you." For one full second, the most feared mafia boss in Korea said absolutely nothing. You could have heard a heartbeat in that room. Several of them, actually, all going far too fast. The executives had gone the specific shade of pale that people turn right before they quietly update their resumes. Director Park looked like he was silently saying goodbye to his family, one member at a time. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered a prayer that was really just the word no, repeated 4 times under their breath. And Joon Woo, who had inherited a billion-dollar empire and a criminal organization on the same terrible night, who had not been contradicted by anyone in 6 full years, tilted his head very slightly to one side. Not in anger, in something closer to disbelief. The way you might tilt your head if a piece of furniture suddenly spoke to you. And worse, made a good point. The whole room waited for the explosion, for the order, for the guards to move. 30 days, he said. Then he turned and walked out. The double doors sealed behind him with a soft hush of expensive engineering, and the entire boardroom exhaled at once. 20 powerful people, all remembering how to be alive at exactly the same moment. Director Park sat down heavily in the nearest chair, without checking if it was his. Vivian picked up her folder. She smoothed the front of her jacket. And as she turned toward the door, she allowed herself exactly one small, private smile. Because 30 days was more than she had walked in expecting, and she had never in her life needed 30 full days to be underestimated. She usually only needed 1. To understand how a single sentence could carry that much poison, you have to go back. Not 30 days, 20 years. Because Joon Woo was not born cold. Once, a very long time ago, there had been a little boy who laughed too loudly at the dinner table and got scolded for it, and secretly loved being scolded, because it meant everyone was still together in the same room. His father, Han Tae-sung, had been a giant of a man with a booming laugh and a stubborn, almost embarrassing belief that business should build bridges instead of walls. While the rest of Seoul's old money kept their circles tight and their doors bolted, Tae-sung threw his open. He shook hands with partners from Lagos and London and Sao Paulo and Jakarta. He would come home smelling of foreign cigars and laughter and tell his son that the future belonged to people brave enough to trust across an ocean. A man who only trusts his own reflection, his father used to say, ruffling the boy's hair with one enormous hand, will die surrounded by mirrors and nothing else. Don't be a man of mirrors. Joon Woo. Little Joon Woo didn't understand it then. He understood it far too well now. His mother was the gentler one, the quieter one, the calm center of a loud and happy house. She used to sit at the piano in the evenings and play until the boy fell asleep against her side. and she smelled of jasmine, and when it rained, she would open the balcony doors just to listen. He remembered all of it: the perfume, the rain, the music, the impossible, unquestioned feeling back then that nothing bad could ever reach the three of them. Then came the partnership. Joon Woo was 9 years old, the year everything ended. His father had entered into a major deal with a foreign business partner, a man whose name the boy would later be forbidden ever to say aloud. There was a signing dinner, champagne in tall glasses, handshakes and photographs. His mother laughing at something across the table, her head tipped back, so alive. And then, weeks later, there was a betrayal so complete and so brutal that it swallowed the entire family whole. Money vanished overnight. Secrets that could destroy the Han Empire ended up in the wrong hands. A war began in the shadows, the kind of war that never makes the newspapers, fought with quiet men and quieter methods. His mother died first. The details were never explained to the boy, only that she was gone, that it was connected to the deal, and that it was the fault of outsiders who could never, ever be trusted. 2 years later, on a rain-soaked night that Joon Woo would spend the rest of his life trying and failing to forget, his father was assassinated in the back of his own car, 3 streets from home. The boy inherited everything: the towers, the money, the organization that operated in the dark beneath the towers, the one the public never saw and never suspected. And he inherited something else too, something far heavier than all of it combined. A single, simple, poisonous idea, whispered into his ear again and again by the one man who stayed behind when everyone else was buried. His uncle, Han Sung-ho, was his father's younger brother, and after the 2 funerals, he was the only family the boy had left in the world. He moved into the estate. He took over the child's education, his schedule, his grief. And every single time young Joon Woo woke screaming from a nightmare, drenched in sweat, calling for a mother who would never answer, his uncle would come and sit on the edge of the bed and stroke his hair and repeat the same gentle, patient lesson, night after night, year after year, until it grew into the boy's bones like a second skeleton. "Your father trusted outsiders," his uncle would murmur in the dark. "He opened the door, and look what walked through it. Look what it cost your mother. Look what it cost you. Trust is a luxury for men who can afford to lose everything. Joon Woo, you cannot afford it. Not ever again. Promise me. Never again. Never again." 2 small words, planted in the dark, watered with a child's grief, grown patiently over 20 years into the coldest man in the whole of Seoul. By the time he was 24, Han Joon Woo ran the empire without blinking. He was disciplined, efficient, merciless, when the situation required it, which was more often than he liked. And here is the strange thing, the thing his enemies found almost insulting. His organization followed a code, rigid, unbending rules that ran through everything he touched. No drugs, never. No trafficking in human beings, no matter the profit, and no harm, under any circumstance, ever, to a child. He was, in the language of his world, a clean monster, if such a contradiction can even exist, feared, respected, and completely, catastrophically alone in the middle of it all. And he never, ever let an outsider close. Especially not the kind of outsider his uncle had spent 2 decades teaching him to fear before he was even old enough to know what he was afraid of. So you can imagine, perhaps, why the sight of a black woman walking calmly into his boardroom, carrying herself like she owned the very floor she stood on, refusing to flinch when he said the cruelest thing he knew how to say, hit Han Joon Woo like a door he thought he had sealed shut forever, swinging suddenly, silently open. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because on the other side of the world, there was a girl the storm had been quietly carrying toward that exact room for a very long time. Her name was Vivian Johnson, and she came from Lagos. She grew up in a small, tidy apartment where her mother, a widow, worked 2 jobs and slept maybe 4 hours a night, and still, somehow, found the energy to check Vivian's homework every single evening by the light of a single lamp at the kitchen table. Vivian's father had died when she was very young, too young to hold much of him beyond a feeling, and her mother had made one decision that shaped the entire rest of their lives. Her children would be educated. If it broke her back, if it took every last thing she had, they would be educated. And it very nearly did break her, more than once. Vivian was the kind of student teachers still talk about years later. She read everything she could get her hands on, sometimes the same book 4 times. She asked the questions the other children were too shy or too bored to ask. And she had a gift that surprised everyone, most of all herself. She was extraordinary with languages. She would hear a phrase one time and keep it forever. Turn it over, take it apart, understand exactly how it worked. So when a scholarship opportunity appeared, a fiercely competitive program sending only the very top African students to study in South Korea, her mother sat her down at that same kitchen table, held both of her hands, and said the thing Vivian would carry with her across an entire ocean and never once put down. "You go," her mother said, her voice fierce and low. "You go, and you make something of yourself, and you do not shrink 1 inch to make anyone in that country comfortable. You hear me? Wherever you stand, you take up your space. It belongs to you." She took up her space. Korea was hard at first, harder than any brochure had promised. The winters bit down to the bone. The homesickness came in waves at the strangest hours. But she learned the language faster than anyone expected, faster than her professors thought possible, until she was dreaming in Korean, arguing in Korean, cracking jokes in Korean that made the whole room laugh. And still, fluency didn't stop the double takes. The subtle discrimination followed her around like weather she couldn't outrun. The way certain shopkeepers watched her hands a little too closely. The way certain classmates spoke to her slowly and loudly, even after she had corrected their grammar in 3 languages. The way some people's smiles never quite made it all the way up to their eyes. She learned to meet all of it exactly the way her mother had taught her, with a spine of steel, wrapped in the most perfect manners you have ever seen. She never once gave them the satisfaction of her anger. She simply kept being excellent, quietly, relentlessly, until her excellence became a thing that was impossible to ignore or explain away. She graduated at the very top of her class. She worked for multinational firms, first the small ones, then the bigger ones, building a quiet reputation as the assistant who never forgot a single detail, who could rescue a collapsing schedule with one hand while translating a legal contract with the other. And through all of it she held on to one stubborn, private dream, that one day she would sit at the head of the table instead of taking careful notes beside it. And then her little brother got sick. His name was Emeka, and he was 17, and he was, without any competition, the funniest person Vivian knew. The kind of little brother who would call her long distance, burning through minutes she couldn't afford, just to describe in full dramatic detail a chicken he had seen behaving suspiciously in the market that morning. When the diagnosis finally came, kidney failure, both of them, the funny phone calls didn't stop, because Emeka refused to let them stop. But a new sound crept in underneath the laughter: fear. The operation he needed was expensive, in a way that made Vivian sit straight down on the floor of her tiny apartment The first time she saw the number written out with all its zeros. Dialysis was buying him time, but time was running out. And time itself, it turned out, cost money that they simply did not have and could not find. She applied for everything: grants, loans, extra shifts, side work at night. She calculated and recalculated the numbers until her eyes burned, and still they refused to add up, no matter how she arranged them. And then, out of absolutely nowhere, an email arrived. It was a recruitment offer. Executive secretary. A firm called Han Group, one of Korea's largest and most secretive conglomerates. A name that opened doors just by being spoken. She hadn't applied. She didn't know a single soul there. But the message said she had come highly recommended by a party who wished to remain private, and the salary attached to it made her read the figure 3 separate times, then close her laptop entirely, then open it again to make absolutely sure she had not hallucinated the number of zeros out of pure desperation. It was more than she had ever been offered in her life. It was, almost to the exact figure, the amount her brother needed to live. It felt like a miracle dropped straight out of the sky, and she was too tired, too desperate, and too full of fragile hope to sit still and ask the one quiet question that might have saved her a great deal of trouble down the road. Who, exactly, recommends a total stranger for a position like that? And more importantly, why? She signed the contract that very same week. She called her mother, and the two of them cried down the phone for 20 minutes, without either of them saying a full sentence. She called Emeka and told him to start planning the very first meal he would eat when he was well again, and he said, without a single second of hesitation, everything, in alphabetical order, starting with Akara, and she laughed until her stomach genuinely hurt, laughed in a way she hadn't in months, because for the first time in a long time, the future had a door in it. She had no idea, not the faintest, smallest idea, that the miracle came with an address, and that address was the beating black heart of Korea's deadliest family. Her very first morning at Han Group, Vivian arrived 40 minutes early, because arriving on time is the same as arriving late. Yet another gift from her mother. She stepped out of the elevator onto the polished expanse of the 53rd floor in her navy suit, folder in hand, chin level, and was met by a receptionist whose welcoming smile flickered and died like a light bulb with a loose wire. "You're the new secretary?" the young woman asked, and her voice did something strange on the word new. "Vivian Johnson." "Yes, good morning." "Oh." The receptionist swallowed hard. "God be with you." Which, Vivian thought, was a genuinely strange thing to say to a brand new co-worker at 9 o'clock in the morning. You said that to soldiers. You said that to people going into surgery. You did not generally say it about a job that mostly involved a calendar. And it only got stranger from there. As she was shown to her desk, a sleek glass station positioned directly outside the double doors of the executive boardroom like a guard post, she began to notice that the other assistants were giving her a very wide berth. Not unfriendly, exactly. More like the careful, respectful distance people keep from someone who has decided to stand under a tall tree in the middle of a thunderstorm. One of them, though, a chatty young man named Kang, with kind eyes and no apparent sense of self-preservation, took pity on her, rolled his chair a few inches closer, and leaned in to whisper, "Okay, listen carefully. I'm only going to say this once. 3 rules. Rule 1. Never let Mr. Han's coffee drop below 55 degrees. He can tell. Don't ask me how. He just can. It's terrifying. Rule 2. If he ever asks whether the report is nearly ready, the answer is always, always yes, even if the report does not exist. even if you have never heard of the report. Yes. He glanced left, then right. Rule 3. And this is the big one. The last person who sat in your chair lasted 9 days. The one before that, 4. There is a betting pool, company-wide. Quite a lot of money in it, actually. And where? Vivian asked, unpacking her pens with perfect calm. Did you place me? 2, Kang admitted. Weeks? Days? He winced apologetically. In my defense, somebody bet you wouldn't make it past lunch. So relatively speaking, I'm your biggest supporter. You bet against me and you want a medal for it. I bet on you, Kang corrected, wounded. 2 days pays 4 to 1. That's practically an act of faith. She almost laughed out loud. Right there at her new desk in the most dangerous office in Seoul. And that, right there, was the thing about Vivian Johnson. She could always find the one funny thread woven into a frightening room, and she would pull it, quietly, gently, just enough to keep herself standing. It was a survival skill, dressed up as a personality, and it had gotten her a very long way. Then the boardroom doors opened, and Joon Woo appeared, and the whole floor went silent as a held breath, Kang's chair rolling itself guiltily back to its own desk, and Vivian understood, in the pit of her stomach, that whatever this job actually was, it was not a normal job at all. He did not greet her. He did not so much as look at her. He walked past her glass desk without a single word, and dropped a stack of files onto it that landed with a heavy, deliberate, unmistakable slap. She looked down. There were dozens of them. Thick ones. Board summaries for the last 2 years, he said, already walking away, his back to her. Cross-referenced against every current contract. Flagged for inconsistencies. On my desk. Of course, sir, she said, not a flicker in her voice. By when would you like it? He paused at the doors. And for the first time that entire morning, he glanced back at her over his shoulder, and there was something in his cold eyes that was almost like amusement. The particular amusement of a man who has just handed someone a task, specifically engineered to break them in half by sundown. This afternoon, he said, and the doors closed. Behind Vivian, Kang made a small sound, like a party balloon, slowly losing all its air. 2 full years of board summaries, cross-referenced against every active contract, flagged for inconsistencies. By this afternoon, it was not a task. It was an eviction notice, with extra steps and better paper. Every executive on that floor knew it. Half of them slowed as they walked past her glass desk over the next hour, pretending to check their phones, secretly hoping to witness the exact and inevitable moment the new woman finally cracked. There was, Kang later confirmed, a fresh side bet opened on the precise time it would happen. Vivian looked at the mountain of files stacked in front of her. She looked at the clock. Then she took off her jacket, folded it neatly over the back of her chair, sat down, rolled up her sleeves one turn at a time, and pulled the first folder toward her. All right, she murmured, mostly to herself, in the low, warm, steady voice her brother would have recognized from an ocean away. Let's see who you people really are. She did not know, as she opened that first file, that somewhere far below the 53rd floor, down in rooms with no windows and no names on the doors, a plan was already quietly in motion. She did not know that inside the very organization she had just joined, someone with a great deal of power and an even greater deal to hide had been watching her arrival with a cold, careful interest that had nothing whatsoever to do with her filing skills. She did not know that within a single week, a bottle would be poured that was never meant to be drunk by her boss, and that she, an ordinary woman who had come all this way just to save her brother's life, would reach out with one hand and changed the seal on it without ever once understanding what it was she had just stopped. She only knew, that first long afternoon, that she had 30 days, one impossible mountain of files, and a mother's voice living rent-free in her chest, telling her to take up her space. And by 4 o'clock, when Joon Woo returned to the boardroom, fully expecting to find either an empty desk or a weeping woman gathering her things, he found neither. He found a single, immaculate, bound report sitting in the exact center of his desk, squared perfectly to the edges, cross-referenced, color-coded, every inconsistency flagged in a clean, quiet margin, and 3 problems circled in red that even his own highly paid auditors had somehow missed entirely. And he found Vivian Johnson at her station just outside his door, calmly refilling her glass of water, completely and utterly unbroken, who looked up when he stopped short in his own doorway, and said, with the faint, polite ghost of a smile that would go on to haunt him for a very long time, "Was there anything else you needed, sir?" Joon Woo stared at her, and for the first time in 6 years, Korea's most feared man did not have a single word to say. The 30 days that followed became a quiet, private war, and the strangest part of it all was that nobody had bothered to tell Vivian she was fighting one. Every single morning brought a fresh task designed from the ground up to bury her, and Joon Woo, to his credit, did not shout, did not threaten, did not so much as raise his voice. He simply handed her the impossible, with a straight face, and walked away to wait for the crack to appear. A 300-page merger contract in 2 languages, needed before lunch. A schedule of 40 back-to-back meetings spread across 2 separate buildings, with 15 minutes of city travel folded impossibly into 5. A demand, delivered at 8 in the morning, for the complete 2-year travel history of an entire foreign delegation, a task that the company's own records department had once needed 3 full days to assemble. He gave her 1 afternoon and a cup of coffee that was, of course, exactly 55 degrees. The executives watched all of it like spectators gathered for a public execution, and, to be fair to them, they had earned their pessimism honestly. They had seen this exact routine before. This was the machine that had emptied her desk chair 9 separate times in 2 years. You did not survive being buried by Joon Woo. You surfaced, gasping, sometime around day 7, and you handed in a resignation letter, and you told your friends over drinks that you had simply left for personal reasons and left it at that. Vivian did not surface gasping. Vivian, in fact, did not surface at all, and the reason was very simple. Vivian was never actually drowning in the first place. She built her systems the way her mother had taught her to build an entire life, quietly, before dawn, brick by patient brick, so that by the time anyone finally thought to look up and check on her, the house was already standing, roof and all. She color-coded the chaos until it made sense. She learned the private rhythms of every department in the building. Which manager lied when he got nervous and rubbed the back of his neck while he did it? Which one hid the bad news carefully in the middle of the good news, hoping nobody read that far? Which vice president could not be trusted with a single deadline but could be trusted, absolutely, with any secret you handed him? She memorized faces and names and old grudges and food allergies and the birthdays of people's children. She took Joon Woo's monstrous, sprawling, self-contradicting schedule and turned it into a thing of pure clockwork beauty. And she did every bit of it, without once, not one single time, asking him whether she had done it well. That last part, more than the competence, more than the speed, more than anything, was the thing that got under his skin and stayed there, because everyone asked. His entire life, from the day he inherited the chair, Everyone who worked for Joon Woo performed for his approval like actors on a stage. They watched his face for the smallest flicker of a reaction. They lived and died a little inside, based on whether or not he nodded. And here, out of nowhere, was this woman who simply did the work, placed it in the exact center of his desk, squared to the edges, and then walked back to her water and her filing as though his opinion of her were nothing more than a weather report for a country she had no plans to ever visit. He tested it once, just to see. She had reorganized an entire regional restructuring plan overnight, catching and quietly fixing a scheduling collision that would have cost the company millions and embarrassed him in front of 3 foreign partners. When she brought the finished plan in, he set it down on the desk without so much as glancing at a single page, and said flatly, to see what she would do, "This is probably full of mistakes." Vivian did not blink, did not shrink, did not so much as shift her weight. "Then it would be a genuine pleasure to correct them, sir," she said, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "Please, take your time. Circle whichever ones you find, and I'll wait right here." And then she simply stood there, patient as a stone in a river, hands folded, an expression of pleasant and total confidence on her face, while the most feared man in Seoul was forced to pretend to read, line by line, a document that both of them already knew was flawless from the first page to the last. He circled nothing. He could not. There was, genuinely, nothing to circle. "That will be all," he said at last, and there was the smallest, most grudging edge of something in his voice that might, in a warmer man, have been respect. "Of course, sir." She turned to leave, reached the door, and then paused with her hand on the frame and added, in a tone so perfectly, flawlessly respectful that it could not possibly be called cheeky, except that it absolutely, completely was, "Shall I leave a red pen on the corner of your desk, sir? Just in case inspiration strikes you later." And she was gone down the corridor before he could summon a single word in reply. Joon Woo sat alone in his glass office 53 floors above the city, and discovered, to his own deep and genuine annoyance, that the corner of his mouth had betrayed him and moved entirely without his permission. He pressed it flat with 2 fingers, hard, as though he could physically shove the expression back down inside himself, where it belonged, and where nobody would ever have to know it had happened. The rest of the company noticed the shift in the weather long before he was willing to admit it to himself. It happened the way these things always happen, quietly, in the small currents running beneath the surface of everything. Managers who had once carefully routed their problems through 3 protective layers of assistance began, one by one, coming straight to Vivian's glass desk instead, because the simple truth was that Vivian solved things. When the Tokyo office sent up a fat contract, riddled with a single poisonous clause that would have quietly signed away a fortune in licensing rights over the next decade, it was Vivian who caught it, buried and disguised in dense legal language on page 94, and it was Vivian who flagged it in red before a single pen touched the signature line. When 2 departments went to open war over a shared budget, a feud that had already burned for a month and poisoned 3 meetings, it was Vivian who quietly found the arithmetic error that had actually started the whole thing, and diffused a war with a single corrected spreadsheet and 1 devastatingly polite sentence. "I believe someone simply transposed 2 numbers back in the spring. It happens to the very best of us, truly." Even Kang, who had bet real money against her, came around completely. He had lost his stake in the office pool inside the first week, and taken the loss with genuinely remarkable grace. "I have never in my entire life," he told her one lunchtime, hand over his heart, deeply solemn, "been so happy to lose 40,000 won." You have ruined gambling for me. I look at you and I feel hope. And hope is very bad for a gambling man's edge." Then he leaned in, dropping his voice. "There's a new pool now, by the way. Bets on exactly how long before he actually says thank you to you. Out loud, to your face. And you've bet what, exactly?" "Never," Kang said, with total serenity. "It is the single safest bet I have ever placed in my life. I am going to buy a small boat with the winnings. I'm going to name the boat after you. You have a gambling problem, Kang. I have a diversified portfolio," Kang corrected, wounded to his core. "And you, Vivian, are my only sound long-term investment. Please don't quit. My boat depends on it." She laughed. She laughed more, honestly, than she had ever expected to, in a place like that, a terrifying glass building full of people who lowered their voices and their eyes whenever the boss walked past. Because here was the thing the fear at the very top hid from everyone. The floor just below it was full of ordinary, frightened, funny, deeply human people, all of them just trying to keep their jobs and get home to their families in one piece. And Vivian had a rare gift for making frightened people feel, for a moment, a little less alone in it. She remembered that the receptionist's mother was in and out of the hospital and asked after her by name, gently, every week. She quietly covered for a terrified junior clerk who had made a filing error that could have cost him his entire career, catching it and fixing it before anyone above them ever noticed, and then never once mentioning it again, not even to him. Within 2 short weeks, fully half of the 53rd floor would have cheerfully walked through fire for her. The other half, the executives in the big offices with the big views, watched her steady rise with a resentment that curdled and thickened into something far uglier than mere professional jealousy. Because a black foreigner who could not be intimidated, could not be buried under work, and could not be flattered into loyalty was simply not a thing their small and careful world had ever prepared them for. And so a few of them, in quiet corners and quieter phone calls, began looking for ways to make Vivian Johnson disappear on their own terms. But none of that, none of the office politics, none of the petty resentment simmering in the corner offices, was the real danger circling that building like a shark beneath calm water. The real danger began on an ordinary Tuesday, and it began with nothing more threatening than a bottle of water. It was late, well past 10 in the evening, and the towers had emptied out into that hollow, humming quiet that big buildings only have at night. Joon Woo was preparing for a critical negotiation with a rival organization, the kind of meeting where a single wrong word, a single wrong tone, could restart a war that had cost more than a dozen lives the last time anyone let it burn. His people had prepared the private meeting room down to the last detail, and there on the polished sideboard sat a neat row of bottled sparkling water. His brand, the specific one he only ever drank when the stakes ran this high. Imported, exclusive, always factory sealed. Vivian came in near the end of the night to lay out the final briefing documents, as she had 100 times before. She knew that room the way she knew her own hands. She knew where every single object was supposed to sit, because knowing precisely where every object belonged was quite literally the entire hidden architecture of her survival in that place. And as she leaned across to set down the last folder, some small, precise, unglamorous instinct at the very back of her mind snagged on something, the exact same instinct that catches a single misplaced comma in a sea of 10,000 words of dense text. The seal on the second bottle from the left was wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not in any way that a normal, busy, tired person would ever have noticed in a dim room at 10 at night. But the thin plastic collar around the cap sat just a fraction too loose against the neck of the bottle, and the little embossed Han Group crest, the one the supplier pressed into the top of every genuine cap at the factory, was rotated the wrong way around, tilted maybe 15 degrees off true north. And Vivian, who had personally logged that entire shipment into inventory just 3 days earlier, who had physically held 100 of those exact bottles in her own 2 hands, knew with a filing clerk's absolute, bone-deep certainty that not one single genuine cap in that whole delivery had ever sat crooked like that. She thought, mildly, with a small internal frown, that someone down in receiving had been careless, that a bottle had been opened somewhere along the line and then clumsily resealed or swapped in from a completely different, older case. Sloppy, unprofessional, exactly the kind of small, avoidable mistake that made her jaw tighten. So she did what any genuinely excellent secretary in the world would have done in that moment. She quietly picked up the imperfect bottle, set it aside on the counter to be reported to the supplier first thing in the morning, and replaced it with a fresh, correctly sealed one, taken straight from the reserve case in the pantry, turning it carefully so the little crest faced precisely the right way. Because Mr. Han noticed things, all things, and she was not about to let a crooked logo sitting on his sideboard embarrass her department in front of dangerous men. She never drank from the bottle she had removed. She never even opened it. She simply set it on the pantry counter beside the sink, made herself a mental note to log it properly in the morning, switched off the lights, and went home to her small apartment to call her brother, who was very keen that night to tell her, in enormous and unnecessary detail, about a vivid dream he'd had involving a goat that apparently owed him a significant amount of money and was refusing to pay up. Down in the parking structure, 3 floors below the street, a man in a maintenance uniform who had never fixed anything in his life sat in the driver's seat of a black sedan and watched the lit meeting room window through a long camera lens, and he waited for a death that simply never came. He watched Joon Woo drink 2 full glasses of water over the slow course of the negotiation. He watched him drink them and smile his cold, controlled smile and shake hands at the end and walk out of that room alive on his own 2 feet. And the man's hands, resting on the wheel, began, very slightly, to sweat. Because failure, in his particular line of work, was not a thing you sat down and explained to your employer over coffee. Failure was a thing you simply did not survive to explain. The bottle should have ended it, cleanly and quietly. A colorless, tasteless compound, enough to stop a strong heart inside a single hour, prepared by careful professionals, placed by someone with the kind of access that could get past a locked door almost no one in that building could open. It should have been perfect. It should have been the end of Joon Woo. And instead, it had been quietly, completely ruined by a woman who simply thought a company logo was sitting on crooked. Vivian went in to work the very next morning with absolutely no idea that she had, in the space of 10 unremarkable seconds the night before, kept Joon Woo alive. She reported the strange bottle to the supplier, who was genuinely baffled and mildly offended by the suggestion, and the whole small matter was quietly closed, filed away in everyone's mind under simple carelessness, and forgotten by the end of the day. Forgotten by everyone, that is, except the man who had failed, and, far more dangerously, the man who had hired him. The second attempt came 11 days later, and this time it wore the shape of an elevator. Joon Woo used a private executive lift, a separate armored car reserved for him and him alone, that ran on its own shaft directly up to the 53rd floor without stopping. It was inspected on a fixed regular schedule, and all of its maintenance was carefully logged in a building system that Vivian had, naturally, absorbed completely into her memory, somewhere around the end of her first week, because his physical safety was, technically, listed among her responsibilities, and Vivian took responsibility the way most other people took breath, without thinking about it, and without any real choice in the matter. She was reconciling the building's service records against the vendor's invoices late one afternoon. A genuinely dull, thankless, headache-inducing task she had actually assigned to herself, because a small discrepancy she'd spotted weeks earlier in the maintenance billing had been quietly bothering her ever since. And that was when she noticed the thing that made her go completely, perfectly still in her chair. The executive elevator had a maintenance entry logged and dated for that very morning. A full cable and brake inspection, marked complete, signed off with a technician's initials. But the invoice from the actual servicing company, the real bill, the paper that money changed hands over, showed no scheduled visit to the building at all until the following week. Someone, somewhere, had entered a maintenance record into the system for work that the vendor had absolutely no record of ever performing, a phantom service, a ghost in the log, signed by a hand that was never there. To Vivian, sitting at her desk with her two spreadsheets open side by side, it read as one thing and one thing only: fraud. Plain, simple, boring fraud. Somebody was faking service records, probably to cover a skipped and expensive inspection, possibly to quietly pocket the servicing fee for themselves. It was exactly the kind of quiet institutional rot she had been hired, in a sense, to sniff out and drag into the light. And a faked safety inspection on the specific elevator that her boss rode alone, by himself, every single working day of his life, was not a thing that Vivian Johnson was willing to let sit unexamined for even one single hour. So she did the boring, correct, deeply unglamorous thing. The thing nobody writes songs about. She flagged the executive elevator in the system as unverified, pending a genuine, witnessed reinspection. And she quietly rerouted Mr. Han's entire morning schedule onto the secure secondary lift, while she personally got to the bottom of the paperwork trail. And she sent him a short, dry, utterly routine note. The same kind of note she sent him a dozen times a day, about a dozen small things. Executive lift held for reinspection, due to a logging discrepancy in the service records. Using the secondary secure car today. My apologies for the minor inconvenience, sir. Joon Woo read the note on his phone in the back of his car, felt the small, mild irritation of a man whose routine has been disturbed for no reason he cares about, and took the other elevator up without giving it a second thought in his life. 90 minutes later, a technician performing the genuine, witnessed reinspection that Vivian had personally demanded found that the primary elevator's brake system had been tampered with, expertly, invisibly, in a precise and patient way that had been carefully designed to hold perfectly for a day or two and then fail all at once, catastrophically, under full load, somewhere right around the 40th floor. The kind of sudden, terrible failure that gets ruled a tragic mechanical accident in a sad little report. The kind that conveniently leaves no assassin standing anywhere nearby to point a finger at. The building's private security handled the whole discovery with total, practiced discretion. It never touched the news. It never touched a police report. Joon Woo was informed, briefly and blandly, that there had been an equipment fault on his private lift, now fully resolved, nothing to concern himself with. He nodded once and moved on with his day, because equipment faults happen in old buildings, and he had an entire empire to run and no time to worry about a break. He was never told, not by anyone, that his new secretary had personally rerouted him off that exact elevator that exact morning. He never once connected the dry little administrative note about a logging discrepancy to the cut brake line that private security had quietly found and quietly fixed. And why on earth would he? To him, sitting at the top of it all, they were simply two completely unrelated administrative facts that had happened to land on an otherwise ordinary Thursday. But somewhere far below the shining towers, in a room with no windows and a very good lock, a phone was slammed down hard enough to crack its own case straight down the middle, and a voice that was deeply, dangerously used to being obeyed the instant it spoke, said a single quiet sentence into the silence of that room. Twice. She has stopped it twice now. And the truly remarkable part, the part I cannot stop thinking about, is that she does not even know that she is doing it. The man on the other end of that call, the one who was actually giving all the orders, did not answer right away. He was a patient man. He had been an extraordinarily patient man for 20 long years, and that patience had made him rich and safe and utterly, comfortably untouchable in his high and quiet place. But now, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not part of his careful plan had appeared right in the middle of it, unbidden, and he did not care for it. He did not like surprises. In his long experience, surprises were precisely how empires cracked and fell. "Find out everything about her," he said at last, his voice soft and even and terrible. "Everything there is. Where she truly comes from. Why she is really here, in this city, at that desk. And most of all, I want to know who, precisely, recommended her for that position. Bring me the name of the hand that put her there." Because he had a suspicion, this careful, patient man in his windowless room, and the suspicion sat cold in his chest and would not leave. Nobody, in his entire experience, stumbles by pure blind luck into the very center of the most heavily guarded family in all of Korea. Not once, certainly not twice, and there would, he knew with grim certainty, be a third time, because he was not, and had never been, a man who stopped after two. The third attempt was the closest of them all. It was the one that came within a single held breath of ending absolutely everything. And Vivian foiled it, without ever knowing there was anything to foil, with nothing more than a stack of paperwork and a small, polite question about a signature. It happened at a satellite office clear across the city, a tall glass tower where Joon Woo was scheduled to appear on the high observation floor for a carefully photographed handshake with a visiting group of foreign investors. A public event, a predictable, choreographed, scheduled thing. He would walk out, stand at the great floor-to-ceiling window with the whole glittering city spread out behind him like a backdrop, and shake hands and offer his cold, controlled smile for the waiting cameras. The time was fixed and printed on an agenda. The position was fixed, marked with tape on the floor. He would stand at that specific window, in that specific spot, at exactly 11:15 in the morning. Across the street, on the flat gravel roof of a parking structure 40 floors up, a man lay flat on his stomach, behind a rifle, and did the slow, patient, terrible arithmetic of murder. Wind speed, drifting gently from the west. Distance, measured twice. The angle of the shot through 2 panes of tempered glass. He had studied the printed schedule for days. He knew exactly where his target would stand, and exactly when. He had done this precise thing before, more than once, and he was very, very good at it. And at 11:14, he settled his breathing into the long, slow rhythm they teach you, and put his eye to the cold rim of the scope, and waited for the man he had been paid a great deal of money to kill, to step calmly into the little framed square of glass he had already chosen. Enjoying the story so far, besties? Then you'll love my ultimate spicy Mafia Boss Love Collection, featuring 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories you can't get on YouTube. Grab your copy anytime using the link in the description. Then let's continue. But at 11:14, Joon Woo was not standing at the window. He was 3 full steps back from it, near the solid interior wall, entirely out of the shot, because Vivian had intercepted him in the corridor barely 30 seconds earlier, with a folder in her hand and an apologetic little tilt of her head. "Sir, forgive me. Just one signature before you go in," she had said, because a wire transfer authorizing a payment for one of his quiet, anonymous causes, the kind she was not officially supposed to understand, but had long ago quietly figured out, and even more quietly begun to protect, required his personal ink before the end of the banking day. And if she missed that narrow banking window, a certain children's hospital across town would not receive its funding on time this month, and Vivian Johnson did not, under any circumstances, miss windows. "It will take you 10 seconds, I promise. I'm so sorry to catch you out here in the hall like this." He had stopped, frowned mildly, and because she had never once, not a single time in all those weeks, wasted so much as a minute of his time, because in the space of 6 short weeks she had somehow earned from him the one currency that he almost never, ever spent on another living soul, a genuine sliver of his trust. He stepped away from the great bright window, back toward the solid interior wall, where, he said, the light was better for reading anyway, and he took the pen she offered him, and he signed his name. Across the street, 40 floors up, the sniper watched through his scope, as his carefully chosen target simply evaporated out of the frame, at the exact instant he had trained for months to fire, and he held his breath, and he waited, finger resting light along the guard, and he did not get another clean shot, because now there were other people moving through the room, aides and investors drifting into his line, and the schedule was breaking apart, and the perfect, predictable, printed geometry that he had built his entire plan around had just been quietly, invisibly dismantled by a woman with a wire transfer and a pair of impeccable manners. After 4 long, agonizing minutes, his window closed for good. He broke the rifle down into its case with hands that had begun, faintly, to shake, and he was gone, down the stairs and into the city, before anyone in either building ever knew that he had been there at all. Joon Woo handed the pen back to her. "Anything else?" "No, sir," Vivian said, sliding the freshly signed folder carefully into her bag with the small, warm, private satisfaction of a woman who has just personally made certain that a ward full of sick children will get their care paid for on time this month. "Thank you. That's everything I needed." She had no idea. She would go home that very night and stand at her tiny kitchen counter eating instant noodles straight from the pot because she was too tired to find a bowl, and video call her brother, and never once in her life know that somewhere across that same glittering city, a man had lowered a rifle from his shoulder in pure, stunned disbelief, entirely because of her. Because of a hospital wire transfer, because of 10 seconds in a corridor. She genuinely, honestly thought she was simply doing her job. But in reality, in the space of 6 short weeks, an ordinary woman who had crossed an entire ocean for no reason grander than saving her little brother's life had, without her knowledge and without her consent, saved the life of Korea's most feared mafia boss 3 separate times, with a crooked logo, with a billing error, and with a single signature in a corridor. And she did not know, could not have known, that she had done even one of them. But someone did know. Someone had watched, from the shadows, as all 3 careful attempts failed in a row, one after another, each one foiled not by armed guards, not by security cameras, not by bodyguards or weapons or luck, but by the quiet, patient, watchful competence of the one single person in the entire building that nobody had ever thought to account for. And that someone was no longer merely curious about Vivian Johnson. That someone had begun, coldly and finally, to see her as a problem. And problems, down in the dark world beneath the shining towers, were never simply managed, or reassigned, or paid off, or sent quietly on their way. They were removed. And the question that now hung over every single thing, the question that Vivian herself could not even begin to ask because she did not yet know that it existed, the question that would very soon reach up out of the dark and drag her straight down into the beating black heart of this family's 20-year-old lie, was a terrifyingly, deceptively simple one. Who on earth wanted Joon Woo dead so badly that they would try 3 separate times in the space of 6 short weeks? Who had that kind of access, that kind of reach, that kind of endless, patient nerve inside a fortress that almost no living person could enter? And why, above all, did the true answer to that question terrify the one single man in all of Seoul who should, by every law of the world, have been the safest of them all? The attacks did not stop, but something else began to change, quietly, in the spaces between them, and it changed so slowly that neither of the two people it was happening to noticed it until it was already far too late to undo. It started with the late nights. There were a lot of them now. Joon Woo worked the way other men breathed, without pause and without complaint. And where the boss stayed, the secretary stayed, because a schedule does not run itself, and a man that dangerous does not sit in an empty building alone. So Vivian was there at 9 and at 10, and more often than she would have liked, at midnight, long after the cleaners had gone home and the great glass tower had emptied down to the two of them and the hum of the lights. And a strange thing happens to people when they are the last two awake in a very large, very quiet place. The distance between them, the careful, professional, armored distance, begins, without permission, to shrink. At first it was nothing, a shared silence that stopped being uncomfortable. Then it was small things. He noticed that she took her tea with too much honey, and one night, without a word, there was already honey in it when she reached her desk. She noticed that he never ate on the long nights, that he simply worked straight through as though hunger were a weakness he had trained himself out of. And so she began, quietly, to order 2 of whatever she ordered, and to leave the second container on the corner of his desk without comment, as though it had wandered there on its own. He never thanked her for it. He always ate it. Kang, when he heard, lost his mind entirely and demanded to know who to pay. Then came the business trips, and the business trips were where the walls really started to come down. Because there is nothing quite like a delayed flight and a strange city and a shared exhaustion to make 2 guarded people accidentally honest with each other. They were stranded once, in a small regional airport at 2 in the morning. An entire delegation collapsed into plastic chairs, when Joon Woo, staring at the dark runway, said, more to the window than to her, "My father used to say a man who only trusts his own reflection dies surrounded by mirrors." He was quiet a moment. "I've spent my whole life proving him wrong. Or right. I can never decide which." Vivian did not fill the silence with something comforting and cheap. That was one of the things about her. She let hard things be hard. "My mother used to say something too," she offered eventually. She said, "Don't shrink yourself to make anyone comfortable." A beat. It's a very inconvenient thing to be raised by. I've been fired for it twice. And for the first time since she had known him, since that terrible boardroom, Joon Woo actually laughed. Not a big laugh, a short, startled, almost rusty sound. The laugh of a man who has forgotten where he keeps it. He looked as surprised by it as she was. And somewhere over that dark runway, at 2 in the morning, something between them shifted onto entirely new ground. There was a moment on that same trip that Vivian would turn over in her mind for a long time afterward. A local official, a puffed-up man who thought foreign meant lesser, had spoken over her twice in a meeting, and then, when she quietly corrected a figure he had gotten wrong, had laughed and asked Joon Woo whether he always let the help do the talking. The room went still. Vivian kept her face perfectly smooth, because she had survived 1,000 rooms exactly like this one, and she knew, better than anyone, how to swallow it and keep moving. But Joon Woo set down his cup very gently and looked at the man for a long, cold moment, the kind of look that made grown men reconsider their life choices, and said, "That woman has already caught 3 errors in your proposal that would have cost you everything. The next time you speak to her, you will do it with respect, or you will never do business with me again. Decide now." The official went the exact color of ash and apologized to Vivian directly, stammering over his own words. And later, in the corridor, she said quietly, "You didn't have to do that." And Joon Woo, not quite looking at her, said, "I don't like when people are wrong." But they both knew, standing in that quiet hallway, that it was not really about the man being wrong at all, and neither one of them said so out loud. Because the more time she spent in the strange orbit of his life, the more Vivian discovered that the man everyone in Seoul was terrified of was not, in fact, the man she was slowly coming to know. The reputation and the reality did not match, and the gap between them fascinated her, the way a locked door fascinates a person who is very good at finding out what things really are. She discovered, for instance, where the money from those anonymous wire transfers actually went. She had been quietly protecting those payments for weeks, without fully understanding them. And one night, following a paper trail the way she followed all paper trails, straight to the end no matter where it led, she found it. Orphanages. 3 of them, across the city, funded in full, every month, by a donor who insisted with almost violent firmness on remaining nameless. Hospital bills, dozens of them, quietly settled for employees who never knew who had paid, who went home, believing the debt had simply been forgiven by some clerical mercy. A shelter for women fleeing violent homes, kept open through a hard winter by a transfer routed through so many shell accounts that it had taken even Vivian 2 nights to trace it back to its single cold source. She saw one of the orphanages with her own eyes, once, entirely by accident. He had sent her across the city to hand-deliver a sealed envelope to an address he would not explain, with strict instructions to give it to the director and no one else, and to ask no questions. Vivian, being Vivian, asked no questions and figured it all out anyway the moment she stepped through the door. It was a home for children with nowhere left to go. Warm, clean, well-fed, newly painted, with good coats hanging by the door and books on every shelf, and a nurse on staff. All of it impossible on the small government stipend such places usually scraped by on. The director, an elderly woman with kind, tired eyes, took the envelope and pressed it to her chest and asked Vivian to please thank the gentleman. And when Vivian said, carefully, that she wasn't sure which gentleman she meant, the old woman just smiled and said, "The one who has never once told us his name in 9 years. Tell him the roof he fixed held through the winter. Tell him the children are warm." Vivian walked back to the car that day and sat in it for a full minute before she could trust herself to drive, because the man who had said she only brought trouble had been quietly keeping a house full of orphan children warm for 9 years without ever once wanting to be thanked for it. And then there were the rules. She began to understand the rules that ran through his whole dark world, the ones his enemies found so insulting. No drugs, no trafficking in human beings, not for any sum, and, absolutely, and without a single exception she could ever find, no harm to a child, ever, by anyone, for any reason. She heard, second-hand and in whispers, what had happened to a man in his organization who had broken that last rule. She did not ask for the details. The whispers were enough. He was not a good man. She was clear-eyed about that, always. He did terrible things, and ordered terrible things, and lived in a world built on fear and blood. But he was not the monster the city believed in either. He was something far more complicated and far more painful than a monster. He was a deeply wounded person, carrying an enormous, ancient grief, wrapped so tightly in someone else's fear that he had forgotten there was a person still alive underneath it all. So one night, near the end of a long one, with the city dark below them, she finally asked him the question she had been carrying for weeks. "If you're capable of all of this," she said quietly, gesturing at nothing, at the traced transfers, the paid bills, the kept shelters, "if you're capable of that much kindness, then why? Why do you hate people you have never met? People who have never done a single thing to you?" He went very still. The temperature in the room dropped back to that first boardroom cold in an instant. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Then tell me," she said. "Because from where I stand, sir, a man who funds 3 orphanages and hates an entire people he's never spoken to isn't a man who hates. He's a man who's been taught to. There's a difference. And somebody taught you." For a long, dangerous moment, she genuinely thought she had finally gone too far. His jaw worked. His hand tightened on the edge of the desk until the knuckles went white. But he did not answer her. He simply stood, gathered his coat, and left. And the silence he left behind was so loud it followed her all the way home. It was around then that the other war, the small, ugly one, began in earnest. Because the executives who resented her had finally found their weapon, and their weapon was the oldest one there is. Someone leaked her private information. Her address, her salary, photographs of her, taken without her knowledge, coming and going from the building. And then, twisted around all of it, a story. The story wrote itself the way these stories always do, ancient and predictable and cruel. She had not earned her position. It whispered across message boards and through the building's back channels. She had seduced her way into it. She was manipulating the boss. She was a gold-digging foreigner who had bewitched a powerful man, and here, look, here are her photos. Here is her salary. Isn't it obvious? Isn't it disgusting? The online harassment came in a flood. Strangers who had never met her filled her messages with a hatred so pure and so practiced it took her breath away. And inside the building, it was worse in its own quiet way. The sudden cold shoulders, the conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the executives who now looked at her with open contempt, they no longer bothered to hide, because now they had a story that made their old prejudice feel like insight. One of them, a senior director named Choi, who had never forgiven her for catching him padding an expense report, stopped her by the elevators one morning in front of a small crowd and said, loud enough for all of them to hear, that everyone knew how a woman like her really climbed a company like this, and that she should enjoy it while it lasted, because men like the boss always got bored of their toys eventually. The little crowd held its breath, and Vivian, who could have wept, who had every right to, simply looked at him and said, in a voice as calm as still water, "Director Choi, the last time you accused someone of climbing, it turned out you'd climbed 40 million won, straight out of the travel budget. I have the report. I've always had the report. Would you like me to be as loud about your career as you're being about mine?" Choi's face drained. He stepped back into the elevator without another word, and the doors closed on his silence, and someone in the little crowd, quietly, began to clap. But being able to win a single ugly moment is not the same as being able to survive 1,000 of them. And for the first time since she had walked into that boardroom, Vivian Johnson thought about giving up. She sat alone in her small apartment one night, her phone face down on the table, because she could not bear to look at it, and she cried. Not loud, dramatic tears. The quiet, exhausted, bone-deep kind. The kind you cry when you are strong for so long that your strength finally just sets itself down for a moment to rest. She thought about her brother, and the operation that was now, finally, scheduled, paid for by this job. This terrible job. She thought about her mother's voice, "Take up your space," and how tired she was of having to fight for a space that should simply have been hers. And she wrote a resignation letter. She wrote it clean and short and dignified, because even breaking she would not give them a mess to laugh at. And she brought it in the next morning and placed it on Joon Woo's desk, squared to the edges, the way she placed everything. He read it in silence. She stood before his desk, composed, spine straight, waiting for the cold nod that would end it. Instead, he picked up the letter, and he held it for a moment, reading it again, and then, without a word, he walked to the small steel wastebasket beside his desk, produced a lighter from his pocket, and set the corner of the page alight. He held it, burning, until the flame nearly reached his fingers, and then dropped the last of it into the bin, where it curled into ash. Vivian stared at him. "That was my resignation," she said. "It was," he agreed, brushing a fleck of ash from his sleeve. "It was also badly timed. You still have 20 days. He looked up at her, and there was something in his face she had not seen before, something raw beneath the cold. "The people spreading those lies about you work in this building. If you leave now, they win, and they will do it to the next person, and the one after that. I don't lose things I've decided to keep, and I have decided," he said, very evenly, "to keep you." For a moment, she did not trust herself to speak. Then, because she was Vivian, she found the thread, and she pulled it. "That's a beautiful speech, sir," she said. "But I wasn't actually asking your permission. I was informing you." She reached over, and calmly, deliberately, she picked up a pen from his desk and set it down again an inch to the left. "I'll stay, but I'll stay because I decided to, not because you burned my letter." A pause, though the fire was very dramatic. 10 out of 10. I felt like I was in a film. And Joon Woo, Korea's most feared man, looked at this woman standing in the wreckage of the worst week of her life, still cracking jokes at his expense. And he almost smiled back. "Now, I want you to stop for just one moment. Right here. Because this is the part of the story that stays with people. This is the part that reminds us that the bravest thing a person can do is refuse to become smaller just because the world is trying to shrink them. If Vivian's courage means something to you right now, if you have ever had to hold your head up while people tried to make you disappear, then do this for me. Subscribe to the channel and turn on that bell so these stories keep finding you. Hit that like button, because it genuinely helps more people find her. And tell me down in the comments, honestly, would you have stayed the way Vivian stayed? Or would you have walked out that door and never looked back? There is no wrong answer. I just want to know. Now stay close, because everything, all of it, is about to change in a single night. The charity gala was the kind of event Han Group used to remind the city of its own power. A great ballroom dripping with light, the powerful and the beautiful and the dangerous all in the same glittering room. Champagne and quiet music, and quieter deals happening in the corners. Vivian ran it the way she ran everything, flawlessly, invisibly, moving through the crowd in a deep green gown, solving a dozen small problems before anyone knew they existed. And Joon Woo, for once, was not entirely watching the room. He was watching her. His uncle watched them both. From across the ballroom, a glass of untouched wine in his hand, Han Sung-ho watched his nephew's eyes follow the foreign secretary across the floor. And something in the old man's careful, patient face went cold and hard as winter stone. They were becoming too close, far too close. 20 years of careful work, of grief shaped like a weapon, of a boy raised to fear the exact kind of person now making him laugh at 2 in the morning over dark runways. It was all coming undone, one honey-sweetened tea at a time. And Han Sung-ho was not a man who let 20 years of work come undone. They left together near midnight, the two of them and a small detail of guards, out through the private rear entrance into the cold, quiet night, where the cars waited. And the night came apart in gunfire. It happened in a heartbeat, the way real violence always does, with no warning, and no music, and no time. The muzzle flashes bloomed from a parked van across the lot, and the guards were shouting, and glass was shattering, and the world became noise and light and the terrible flat cracking of automatic fire. And in the middle of it, Joon Woo did not think. He did not calculate. He did not weigh the risk. He simply turned and threw his whole body over Vivian's, driving her down and back behind the armored car, shielding her with everything he had, his arms around her head, his back to the guns. "Stay down," he said into her ear, low and fierce. "Whatever happens, you stay down. Do you understand me?" The guards returned fire. The van's engine screamed. And in the chaos of it, in the confusion of bodies moving in the dark, Vivian felt Joon Woo suddenly stiffen against her, felt him jerk. And then she saw, in the strobing light, that his hand had come away from his side, dark and wet, and that the dark and wet was spreading. "You're hit," she said, and her voice did not sound like her own. "Joon Woo, you're hit." "I'm fine," he lied, through his teeth. But she was already moving, already pressing both her hands hard against the wound, the way she had once learned in a first aid course she had taken years ago for a certificate she never thought she would use, pressing down with all her weight, keeping the pressure, keeping him talking, keeping him here, while the guns finally fell silent, and the attackers fled into the night, and the guards came running, and she screamed for a car, for a hospital, for someone, anyone, to help her, her green gown soaking through with the blood of the man who had said, on her very first day, that he did not like women who looked like her. And here is the thing nobody in that parking lot understood in the moment. Vivian had it wrong, or half wrong, because in the confusion of the dark, she had not simply been shielded. When the second shooter had swung wide, when a round had come screaming toward Joon Woo's exposed head as he covered her, it was Vivian who had seen it. Vivian who had wrenched them both hard sideways by pure instinct, so that the bullet meant to kill him tore instead through the outside of his side. She had moved him. Again. The fourth time. Only this time it had cost. This time there was blood. This time it was real, and it was on her hands. And she would not let go of him. Not for anything in the world. At the hospital, everything became white light, and running footsteps, and the metallic smell of fear. They took him back through swinging doors and left her standing in the hall in her ruined gown, shaking, her hands still red. And then a doctor came out, grim, fast, and said the words that stopped her heart. He had lost too much blood. He needed a transfusion, immediately, and his was a rare type, and their supply was low, dangerously low, and they were calling other hospitals, but there was no time. There was so little time. Vivian did not hesitate for even a second. "Test me," she said, already rolling up her blood-stained sleeve. "Test me right now." And the universe, which had spent this entire story arranging quiet, impossible coincidences, arranged one more. She was a match. A perfect match. The Nigerian secretary and the Korean mafia boss, two people who could not have been born further apart, who had started this whole thing on opposite ends of a boardroom with a cruel sentence hanging between them, turned out, at the level of the blood in their veins, to be exactly, precisely the same. She lay on the gurney beside him as the line ran from her arm to his, giving him the one thing she had that could keep him in the world, and she watched his pale face, and she was too tired and too frightened to pretend any more that she did not care whether this man lived or died. He drifted up out of the dark an hour later, weak, gray, but alive, and the first thing he saw was her, sitting beside his bed, a bandage on her own arm, refusing to leave. Across the room, his closest advisor, an old and loyal man who had known Joon Woo since he was a grieving boy, stood watching the tube that had carried her blood into his master's veins, and he could not stop staring at it. Finally, quietly, almost helplessly, the old man said the only thing in his heart. "Sir, her blood is in you now." He shook his head slowly. You said you hated black women, that they only bring trouble." Joon Woo turned his head on the pillow. He looked at Vivian, asleep now in the chair, exhausted, her hand still resting near his, her blood keeping his own heart beating in his chest. And when he spoke, his voice was barely more than a breath, but it was the truest thing he had said in 20 years. "I was wrong," he said. "I was wrong about everything. And I think I have been wrong for a very long time." He did not yet know how right he was. He did not yet know how right he was. Went, or who had planted it, or that the answer to every question he had never dared to ask was about to come clawing its way up out of a locked file in the dark. He only knew, lying in that hospital bed with a stranger's blood in his veins and a stranger's hand near his, that the wall he had spent his whole life hiding behind had just been breached, and that he did not, for the first time he could remember, want to build it back. Meanwhile, Vivian was healing, and Vivian was curious, and a curious Vivian was the single most dangerous thing in all of Seoul, because while she sat by his bed through those long recovery days, with nothing to do but think, she began, quietly, to pull at threads. The attack had been too coordinated, the men too well informed. They had known the exact rear exit, the exact timing, the exact route. That was not luck. That was inside knowledge. And once Vivian Johnson started asking how someone had known, she did not stop until she had followed the question all the way down to the bottom, no matter what was waiting for her there. She started, as she always did, with the paperwork, old company files, archived records, the kind of dusty, forgotten documents that a mafia family keeps buried because destroying them entirely feels too much like admitting they existed. And deep in that archive, in a box that had not been opened in years, under a layer of unrelated papers, as though someone had hidden it in plain sight, she found a single file, old photographs, faded letters, records of bank transfers from 20 years ago, and a name, The name of the foreign businessman. The one Joon Woo was never allowed to say. The man the whole family believed had betrayed them, had destroyed them, had gotten Joon Woo's mother killed and his father assassinated. The original sin, the source of all that hatred, and all those rules, and all that carefully cultivated fear. Vivian sat on the cold archive floor and read the file by the light of her phone. And as she read, her blood, the same blood now running through Han Joon Woo's veins, slowly ran cold, because the story in that file was not the story the family believed. It was not even close. The dates did not match. The transfers went the wrong way. The letters said something else entirely. And slowly, page by page, sitting alone on that floor in the dark, Vivian began to understand that the foreign man who had been blamed for everything, the man whose face launched 20 years of prejudice, had not betrayed the Han family at all. He had been framed. Somebody had altered the evidence. Somebody had rewritten the past. Somebody had taken an innocent man and built a monster out of him, and then handed that monster to a grieving 9-year-old boy and told him night after night, in the dark, that this was the reason he must never, ever trust an outsider again. Somebody inside the family had done this. Somebody who had been there. Somebody who had stayed. And as Vivian's shaking hand turned to the very last page of that file, to the one document that named the hand behind all of it, she heard, echoing softly down the long, dark aisle of the archive behind her, the sound of a single pair of footsteps, unhurried, patient, coming closer. The footsteps stopped, close behind her, in the dark, between the archive shelves. Vivian did not scream. She did not run. She was far too intelligent for either of those things. And besides, some part of her had already known, from the very first page of that file, exactly whose footsteps they would turn out to be. She simply closed the folder in her lap, slowly, and rose to her feet, and turned. And there in the dim light of the archive stood a familiar figure, an elegant older man in a dark, perfectly tailored coat, his silver hair immaculate, his hands folded calmly in front of him, his kind grandfatherly face arranged into an expression of gentle, almost sorrowful regret. Han Sung-ho, the uncle, the one who stayed. You are a remarkable young woman, he said, and his voice was warm and reasonable and terrifying, precisely because it was both. I've known that from the beginning, of course. I'm the one who recommended you, after all. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her. You, Vivian said quietly, you brought me here. I did. He smiled, sadly, the way a man smiles at a puzzle he almost admires. Though I confess it did not go at all the way I intended. You see, my dear, I needed someone new near my nephew. Someone disposable. Someone foreign. Someone he would despise on sight. Someone whose presence would keep his prejudice fresh and raw and useful right when I needed it most. A black woman in his boardroom was, forgive me, meant to be a small, ugly reminder of everything I spent 20 years teaching him to hate. You were supposed to be a symbol, a prop, a thing he would look at every morning and feel his old wound ache. He took a slow step closer. What I did not plan for, he said, and now the warmth thinned, and the thing underneath it showed through like bone through skin, was that you would be so extraordinarily inconveniently good at surviving. 3 times my people came for him. 3 times you, a filing clerk, without even knowing you were doing it, put your hand out and stopped it. And worst of all, worst of everything, you made him laugh. Do you have any idea what you have cost me? And there, in the dark of that archive, Han Sung-ho finally told her the whole of it, the way villains do when they believe there is no longer any reason not to, when they believe the person listening will never leave the room to repeat it. He told her that 20 years ago, it had not been the foreign partner who betrayed the Han family. It had been him. His own brother, Tae Sung, had been building bridges to the wider world, opening doors, sharing power, and every open door was a door that Sung Ho did not control. So he had gone to that foreign businessman, the innocent man, and he had framed him, meticulously, patiently, forging the transfers, planting the secrets, rewriting the story from the inside. He had arranged the death of his own sister-in-law and made it look like the outsider's doing. And 2 years later, when his brother began to suspect, when Tae-sung got too close to the truth, Sung Ho had arranged the assassination in the back of that car, 3 streets from home, and then wept convincingly at the funeral, and then moved into the estate, and then sat on the edge of a grieving little boy's bed, night after night after night, and built, out of that child's shattered heart, the perfect, obedient, isolated instrument he had always wanted. I gave him his hatred, Sung Ho said, and there was something almost like pride in it. I built it with my own hands, brick by brick, over 20 years. A frightened man is an obedient man. An isolated man is a controllable man. As long as he trusted no one, he needed me. As long as he hated the outside, he could never build a single alliance I did not approve. He was never a mafia boss, my dear. He was my puppet. And you, he shook his head slowly. You walked in and started cutting the strings without even knowing they were there. And the file? Vivian asked. Because even now, even here, she needed the whole truth. You kept the file, the proof, all these years. Why? The old man's smile flickered. Insurance, he admitted. One never destroys the thing that gives one power over the dead. I never imagined a clever girl on a bad day would come looking through an archive that hasn't been touched in a decade. So what now? She said. Now, said Han Sung-ho, and men stepped out of the shadows behind him on either side. You and I are going to take a short drive, because you, my dear, have become the single most dangerous thing in my nephew's life. Not because you tried to kill him, but because you are the one person alive who might make him whole, and a whole man does not need his uncle at all. They took her that night. Joon Woo was still weak, still bandaged, still healing in the estate when the call came through on his private line, the number that only a handful of people in the world possessed. And when he answered it and heard his uncle's voice, warm and reasonable and calm, his blood turned to ice before a single word of threat had even been spoken. Because a man knows, on some animal level, when the ground has been pulled out from under his entire life. I have something of yours, Sung Ho said pleasantly. Your secretary. The clever one. She found a file she should not have found, and now we have a small problem, you and I. If you touch her, Joon Woo said, very quietly. Oh, spare me. You'll want to hear this. She found the truth, Joon Woo, about your father, about your mother, about the man you've hated for 20 years. A pause, delicate as a blade. About me. And now you have a choice to make, and I want you to make it carefully, because it is the last one I will ever offer you. You can come to me. You can abandon the summit tonight. The summit that determines whether you keep your empire or lose it to your rivals. And you can come and try to save this woman. Or you can stay and secure your power and keep everything your family bled for. Choose. Your empire or the woman you swore, on your very first day, that you would never love. And for the first time in his adult life, Joon Woo did not have to think about a choice at all. There was a summit that night. The most important negotiation of his career, a room full of the most powerful and dangerous men in the country, waiting to divide up territory and settle old scores. A room where his absence would be read as weakness and his empire would begin, that very hour, to be carved apart. Men had spent years maneuvering for this table. Wars had been fought over less. Joon Woo did not go to the summit. He stood in his study, still bleeding faintly through the bandage, and he looked at the phone in his hand, and he understood, with a clarity that felt almost like being born, that the empire had never once made him happy. That the power his uncle had shaped him to crave had only ever been a cage with a very good view. That in 24 years of being feared by everyone, exactly one person had ever looked at him and seen a human being underneath, and had refused, from the first moment, to be afraid. "Ready the cars," he told his advisor. "All of them, everyone loyal. We're going to get her." "Sir, the summit. Let them have the summit," Joon Woo said, and he checked the weapon in his hand with a steadiness that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with purpose. "Let them have all of it. It was never mine anyway. It was his. Tonight, I take back the only thing in this life I actually chose." The rescue unfolded at an abandoned shipyard on the cold edge of the city. All rust and salt and towering shadows. Shipping containers stacked into black canyons. The sea slapping darkly against the docks. It was the kind of place men chose when they did not intend for anyone to walk out. And Joon Woo walked in anyway. Wounded, outnumbered, and utterly without fear. Because a man who has finally decided what he is willing to lose everything for becomes, in that moment, the most dangerous man in any room. There was gunfire. There was betrayal. The ugly, spinning kind, as loyalties inside the organization split down the middle. Guards who had served the family for years, suddenly forced to choose, in a single heartbeat, between the uncle who signed their checks and the nephew who was tearing the whole rotten structure down. Some chose Sung-ho, more than Joon Woo would have liked, but some, enough. The ones who had grown quietly sick of the fear, the ones who had noticed the cruelty curdling into something they no longer recognized, chose Joon Woo and turned their weapons around, and the shipyard erupted into a war 20 years in the making. Vivian, tied to a chair in the cold heart of it, in a container lit by a single swinging bulb, heard the gunfire come closer and closer, and she did the only thing she could do. She kept her head. She had worked her wrists against the ropes for an hour already, patiently, methodically, the way she did everything, and when one of Sung-ho's men was pulled away to the fighting, she got a hand free, and then the other, and she was reaching for the door when it burst open, and Joon Woo was there. Blood on his shirt, a gun in his hand, and an expression on his face she had never seen on it before and would never forget. "You came," she said. "You abandoned the summit. You abandoned everything. For me. You're going to have to update the schedule," he said, out of breath, half a wild laugh in it. "And even now, even here," she nearly laughed back, "I've made a mess of it." But it was not over. Because Han Sung-ho was still there, at the far end of the container, an old man with a pistol of his own and 20 years of lies finally cracking apart around him. And when he saw the two of them together, the nephew he had shaped and the woman who had unmade all his work, something in him broke loose entirely. "You ungrateful boy," he hissed. "I made you. Everything you are, everything you have, I built it. Your grief was clay in my hands, and you would throw it all away. Throw me away. For her? You didn't build me," Joon Woo said, and his voice was terribly, finally calm. "You broke me, and called the pieces a man. You killed my father. You killed my mother. You took a 9-year-old's broken heart and you spent 20 years poisoning it so that I would never have a single friend in the world but you. You made me hate people I had never met, so that I would never love anyone but the man who was already dead inside my own house." He took a step forward. "And the strangest part, Uncle, the part I'll spend the rest of my life sitting with, is that it almost worked. You almost got away with all of it, and it was undone in the end. Not by an army, not by a war, but by one woman you dismissed as a symbol. You never even saw her coming, because you couldn't. You'd taught yourself not to see people like her at all, just like you taught me. The confrontation that followed was brutal and brief, and I will not linger on it, because the truth of these things is that they are never as clean as anyone deserves. But when the smoke cleared and the sea kept slapping at the docks and the single bulb kept swinging, Han Sung-ho's 20 years of lies had ended. His men had scattered or surrendered or fallen, and the corrupt faction he had built inside the organization, the whole rotten scaffolding of fear and control, had come crashing down all at once. The way rot always does the moment the beam that held it up is finally pulled free. Joon Woo crossed the container and knelt in front of Vivian, and, with hands that shook now that they were finally allowed to, untied the last of the ropes from her wrists. "You saved my life," he said quietly, "3 times before this. I know now. I know it was you. All of it. The bottle, the elevator, the window. It was always you. 4 times. Vivian corrected gently, rubbing her wrists. "The gala. I moved us." He closed his eyes. 4 times, he agreed. "You saved my life 4 times, before I ever once did anything to deserve it. And on your very first day, I told a room full of people that you only brought trouble." He opened his eyes and looked at her, and there were things in that look that a lesser man would never have let anyone see. "I have never been more wrong about anything in my entire life. And I have spent that life being taught to be wrong about exactly this. About you. About people like you. I'm so sorry, Vivian, for the first thing I ever said to you. And for the 20 years that made me able to say it." And Vivian Johnson, who had crossed an ocean and stared down a monster and given her own blood to keep a stranger's heart beating, looked at this broken, healing, honest man kneeling in front of her in the wreckage of his uncle's lies. And she said the only thing there was to say. "Then let's both do better than the people who taught us fear," she said. "Starting now. Now, before I tell you how it ends, and it does end beautifully, I want to say one last thing to you. Whoever you are, wherever in the world you're watching this from tonight. If this story has moved you, if you've felt something real, watching a man unlearn a hatred that was never even his to begin with, and watching a woman refuse to become smaller no matter how hard the world pushed, then please, take 1 second and subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell, because stories like this one are the only kind we tell here, and I would love for you to stay. Hit that like button to help this story reach someone who needs it tonight. And drop a comment and tell me honestly if you had been Vivian on that very first day. If a powerful man had looked you in the eye in a room full of people and said those cruel words to your face, would you have stayed and proven him wrong? Or would you have walked away with your dignity and never looked back? There is no wrong answer. I just want to hear yours. Now, let me tell you how it ends. Months later, the Han group that emerged from all of it was almost unrecognizable, and every bit of the change was for the better. With the uncle gone and the corrupt faction swept out, Joon Woo did something no one who feared him could ever have predicted. He began, slowly, patiently, to pull his family's empire up out of the shadows and into the light. Not all at once, not perfectly, but steadily, the way Vivian did everything, brick by brick. The company's legitimate arms flourished. Its international offices, once bolted shut against a world he'd been taught to fear, threw their doors open the way his fathers had, all those years ago, before the poison. Partners from Lagos and London and Sao Paulo and Jakarta sat once again at the Han family table. And this time no one framed them, and this time no one died. And at the center of that transformation, no longer standing behind a glass desk outside a boardroom, stood Vivian Johnson. She was not a secretary anymore. Joon Woo had offered her the title she had earned 4 times over, Director of Global Operations, and she had accepted it. And she was, by every account, magnificent at it, sitting at last, at the head of the very kind of table she had dreamed about as a girl doing homework by a single lamp in Lagos. Her brother, by the way, in case you were wondering, and I know you were, had his operation, and it went perfectly, and he made his mother promise to record him eating that first meal, and he ate it, all of it, in strict alphabetical order, starting with akara, exactly as he'd sworn he would, and he cried, and then he made everyone else cry, and then he made a joke about the goat that still owed him money, and the whole family laughed until they couldn't breathe. Kang, I should also tell you, lost the thank you pool spectacularly, because Joon Woo not only thanked Vivian, he did it publicly, at a company dinner, in front of 200 people, and Kang had to pay out to half the building and took it, as always, with tremendous grace, and yes, he still bought the boat, and yes, he still named it after her. The story could have ended there, and it would have been enough, but there was one more evening. It was a charity gala, a good one this time, the kind his father would have loved, the ballroom full of light and music and people from every corner of the world. And late in the evening, a reporter, one of those sharp, smiling ones who does her homework, caught Joon Woo near the edge of the floor, with a glass in his hand, and asked him, with a raised eyebrow and a knowing look, the question the whole city had been whispering for months. "Mr. Han," she said, "is it true that you once stood in your own boardroom and said, out loud, that you didn't like black women?" The people nearby went quiet. It was, after all, a dangerous question to ask a dangerous man. But Joon Woo did not go cold. He did not tense. He simply looked across the crowded ballroom to where Vivian stood, radiant in deep green, laughing at something, entirely herself, taking up every inch of her space exactly as her mother had taught her. And he smiled, a real smile, the kind he'd once had to press flat with 2 fingers, and he turned back to the reporter and answered her, clearly, so everyone could hear. "It's true," he said. "I did say that, and I was not speaking from experience when I said it. I was speaking from pain. From a wound someone else put in me when I was too young to defend myself, and then spent 20 years keeping open." He paused. "And I have learned, the hard and expensive way, that pain is a terrible teacher when you never once stop to question the lesson. I confused fear with truth. I thought a wall was protecting me, when the whole time it was only keeping me alone. The best decision I ever made in my life was listening. After I spoke, the room was silent for a moment, and then, softly, someone began to applaud, and then someone else, and then the whole ballroom, and it rolled across the floor like a wave. And that was when Joon Woo set down his glass and crossed the room, through the applause, to Vivian, and got down on one knee in front of everyone, in front of the whole glittering city that had once feared him, and looked up at the woman who had walked into his boardroom and refused to disappear. Vivian looked down at him, and her eyes were shining, and only she could have found the thread in a moment like that, and only she would have dared to pull it. "You almost fired me," she said, her voice trembling with laughter and tears at once. "On my very first day, in front of everyone. I know, Joon Woo said, smiling up at her, unafraid, at last, of anything. And I have spent every single day since then trying to deserve a second chance. Marry me, Vivian. Let me spend the rest of my life being wrong about the one thing I'm finally right about. And she laughed, and she cried, and she said yes. The room erupted. Somewhere in the back, Kang was weeping openly, and also, almost certainly, collecting on a bet. So that is the story. Of a man who was taught to hate before he was old enough to know better, and a woman who refused to shrink herself to survive him, and the long, hard, beautiful road that led one of them to unlearn a lie and the other to change a heart without ever once betraying her own. Because here is the thing worth carrying with you tonight, the real heart of all of it. The strongest walls we ever build are the ones made from old wounds and older lies, and the bravest thing a person can ever do is find the courage to tear them down. Joon Woo thought his prejudice was protecting him. It was only ever a prison someone else had built, with him locked inside. And Vivian never once changed who she was to earn a single ounce of respect. She simply stayed true to herself, and her truth was so steady and so unshakable that in the end, it changed every person it touched. If this story kept you hooked, there's plenty more waiting for you in my ultimate spicy Mafia Boss Love Collection. You'll get 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories not available on YouTube. Get instant access through the link in the description. Kemper. Do me that one last kindness. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. Like this video so it can find the next person who needs to hear it. And leave me your answer in the comments. Would you have stayed the way Vivian stayed? I'll be reading. Thank you, truly, for spending this hour with me. And stay close, because our next story begins with a wedding, and a betrayal, and a single decision that changes 4 lives forever. You are not going to want to miss it. Until then, take up your space. All of it. It belongs to you.